Thank you so much for joining me today, Jennifer, and all the way from London, England. So it's a real pleasure to have you as part of our inaugural Kindness Festival here for Karuna Hospice Service. My first question really relates to what your motivation was for founding this incredible. I was so thrilled when I heard Compassion in Politics. So what motivated you to found such an organization?
It was really the realization that every form of human suffering that we witness, every injustice that we witness, whether it's hunger, whether it's wrongful imprisonment, whether it's how we treat refugees seeking asylum, whether it's homelessness, they're all essentially linked by one thing, and that is the absence of compassion. Because our nations have the resources to deal with avoidable suffering, and yet so often we don't. Suffering is, of course, inevitable in life. We're humans, but there's a large portion of suffering that isn't inevitable. It's completely avoidable. And that, for me, is the purpose of politics. Politics is about everything we do in our lives. It affects every aspect of our lives. It affects what we can eat, what we can drink, what shelter we have access to, what education we have access to, how we can gather. All of these things are governed by politics. And so what politics has this incredible, politicians have this incredible power to do good in our society. And yet there's a lot of good that isn't being done that needs to be done. So we thought if we could raise the level of compassion within the political sphere, then that would drive outcomes that alleviated suffering and addressed some of the really entrenched inequalities and injustices that we see in our modern and prosperous societies.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that we actually have these inequities? Like what's behind that from a political perspective? What's behind the inequities?
We're seeing a real shift at the moment, that tectonic plates of how we live and how we're governed and the world order are shifting at the moment. And essentially, in the post-war era, there was an absolute realization of how fragile and valuable life was, and that we were all in it together. And in the United Kingdom, that led to the founding of the welfare state and this fantastic declaration by government that it would take care of its citizens from the cradle to the grave. And that social contract that was founded after so many people gave their lives to defend their nation led to the founding of the welfare state, to huge housing programs, to education, and really created not an equal society, but a much more equal society than it had been. And then we had the advent of a new economic model, sort of, I'll call it aggressive neoliberal economics, which came in with Reagan in America, with Thatcher in the UK, and then versions of it have happened in Australia and all over the world. And what that did was it shifted the emphasis away from how we live collectively to how we live individually. Steadily, the threads of the social contract that bound us all together, that gave us this sense that we're all in it, and if someone else is suffering, that's my problem, and I need to address that. We those connections were snipped, and a new ideology took hold, which was it's down to the individual. You've got to succeed. You've got to get as far as you can in life. If you're failing, it's because you haven't done something right. And then the most sinister aspect of it all came when culturally we were encouraged to blame those who'd fallen upon hard times and to see them as malingerers or people who were somehow milking the system. And then the cruelest twist of all was then the language of psychotherapy was used, and we were told we were enabling people if we actually tried to help them, and we just needed to leave them get on their own 2 feet. And anyone who has really suffered with a personal catastrophe or loss or illness knows that it's not a lack of desire to get back on one's feet, and that we all need help at moments. But this ideology took hold and divorced us really from what it is to be human and connected, and to really live in a way that exhibits our fundamental core human quality of caring.
What do you think was the catalyst for that dramatic shift in ideology?
I think it was the ideas that emanated from Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics, and the idea of trickle-down economics, that we just let the rich get as rich as they like, and that will then lead to wealth cascading downwards. Now, there is more wealth in our societies, and we can't dismiss everything, but inequality has grown exponentially, and that has caused all sorts of problems. It's caused resentment. The sort of things that we're seeing happening in the States and across Europe, the rise of the far right, they're driven by a whole swathe of people who don't feel seen, don't feel valued, don't feel like they have a stake in this society, which has, you know, where we're bombarded with images of the super wealthy living their glossy lives, and yet our lives don't match up to that.
Mm. You said earlier about the influence of the political system on society generally. Do you think people understand how much influence politics and politicians and policy, I guess, have on our day-to-day lives and on our, I guess, on our social infrastructure and our cultural way of living and being? Do you think people are generally have an awareness of that?
I think people are really turned off by politicians at the moment and by politics at large, and they think that they're just not going to bother with politics. But the reality is that all of our lives, politics is about all of our lives, and so people think that they can switch off from politics, but actually, whether you've got an effective health system, whether your roads or your transport system are working, whether your education system is working, all of that is about politics. And so to disengage from that is to really step away from being involved in how we live.
So it's important. It sounds like what you're saying is that it's important for people to be involved in some form or another, to have some sort of connection or at least some sort of level of awareness around the political process.
I think to be aware is really important. And of course, in Australia, you have something which we really envy in the UK, which is mandatory voting,
Yeah.
which we don't have. So we have terribly low turnouts in some elections, which means that the government may only have been voted on by less than a majority of the population.
Mhm.
So Australia is doing much better in that respect. But I think we have to pay attention, and in Australia, where compassion in politics is just beginning to work, we see that no country is immune from what's happened in the States. No
Mm.
country can be complacent. No democracy can be complacent at this moment. And so, how we relate to each other, how we connect to each other, all of that is part of the political landscape, because what feeds the things that undermine democracy is disconnection, it's blame, it's judgment, it's intolerance. So, all of us, whether we want to be actively engaged in politics, and understandably, a lot of us don't, but simply how we connect in our daily lives is part of that political infrastructure. It's part of our community. It's part of the network and the resilience that we are building as we go about our daily lives.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, the compassion in politics seems such a contradiction in terms because of the state of the political system across the world. I mean, there's so much disarray actually politically in so many countries. So, what qualities then do you see as being important when it comes to people and politics? And also just doing government business. So, not even just the political system, but how policies and practices are implemented out in society. The I mean, when I first saw the title of the organization, even I went, it's like compassion in politics.
It's so
Is it possible at all? So, what do you think is important? What qualities are important for people and politics?
it's so funny you say that because when we started, we would say what our organization was called, and people would say, "Well, that's funny," or "There's an oxymoron."
Yeah.
And what's interesting now, 7 years on, in fact, it's almost exactly 7 years since we were founded, is that no one questions the need for compassion in
Yeah.
politics. Everyone knows that right now what we need is compassion and the values that come with compassion, and that's honesty, and that's loyalty, and that's courage. And really, we named the organization Compassion in Politics because we wanted compassion put back into the
Mm.
political space
Yeah.
so that it could be seen as a legitimate political driver.
Yep.
And, and so we wanted the word compassion used by commentators, we wanted it used on the floor of the House, and we wanted the science of compassion there as well. As you know, there is a lot of science underlining the work that we do because it's about the environment that politics is done in and the environment in which we all live in. And really our work is focused in two areas. One is how we do politics, and we do politics in an aggressive, binary, conflict-based way, which puts
Mm.
those who are involved in it into a fight or flight state. And what we know from evolutionary psychology is that when you're in a fight or flight state, you can't access the part of your brain which is capable of the nuanced, complex thinking which is required to solve the interlocking and incredibly tough existential threats that we face. So most of our politicians are in a fight or flight state, trying to defend their position from outside their own party and from within their own party, and at the same time trying to make decisions that affect all of our future. So we look at how politics is done, and then we look at what the outcomes are. We think it is absolutely wrong and extraordinary that governments can pass legislation knowing that the impact on those in the most vulnerable circumstances will be adverse. And in the United Kingdom, when the policy of austerity was brought in, these were policies that it was known would increase child hunger, increase homelessness, it's led to deaths. And yet, despite all that evidence being there, governments whose job is to protect the most vulnerable in society deliberately implemented policies that have had a terrible impact on many people. So in terms of policy, we say that no government should enact policy that's going to push those in difficult circumstances into even worse circumstances, into destitution, and that is happening. So we look at how we do politics and then what the outcomes of politics are.
So you've done quite a lot of work with governments during the course of your career and your professional life. How have you found it? Do you tear your hair out with frustration, or do you find that there is a group of people that are keen to change the political system and make it a kinder, more compassionate, more empathic sort of system?
There are a large number of politicians who do want the system changed, but the problem is that once those politicians then rise up the ranks to a position of power, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to then oppose the system of which they're a part.
Mm.
So, we're looking at some fairly basic things, both in the UK and in Australia. For example, how politicians speak to each other on the floor of the House. I
Mm.
mean, it's
Yeah.
absolutely extraordinary that our nations are run by people who jeer, boo, humiliate,
Mm.
um, make jibes at, ridicule. That is not the way to run a country. You wouldn't allow that behavior in any school, any office, or any boardroom. And
Mm.
yet it's normalized in the political space. So we think that let's just start with the basics. Let's start with civility and how we talk to each other. And we have, had meetings with the Speaker of the House in the United Kingdom Parliament, and they're convinced, the speaker and the people that surround him are convinced that this is an important tradition and the public would really miss it. Well, it's something that gets eyeballs, rather like a Punch and Judy show or a pantomime. That doesn't mean that it's the right
Mm.
way to
Mm.
operate. So we see a lot of misogyny and patriarchal attitudes hidden within these traditions, which are based very much on male notions of power and of aggression and of force. And of course, that's not how we get inclusive, human-centered outcomes.
Mm. Is that historically how, I mean, I guess in democracies, authoritarian sort of states, you understand that. But it seems to, again, to me to be almost a contradiction to want to have that aggressiveness in what is regarded as a democratic sort of system. The whole basis of democracy is collaboration and consultation and cooperation, but it doesn't seem to be how it's playing out. So historically, has it always been that adversarial sort of approach, or is that something that's, in the last century or whatever?
Well, if we look at the Westminster model of democracy, which I'm afraid we kindly gifted to Australia, although Australia, I think, is Australian democracy is light years ahead of us in many ways. It's based on the idea of two warring factions who sit on green benches, two swords lengths apart to prevent conflict. And of course, democracy developed in a very piecemeal way. To begin with, it was only the monarch that could rule, and then the gentry could rule, and then men could rule. And it's relatively recently that women have been given the vote, within just
Yeah.
over 100 years ago. So democracy wasn't, if one were to start from scratch now to design how democracy functions, we would come up with a solution that's very different from the democracy we've inherited. So it's a very patched up version that has really evolved through the grudging relinquishing of power to new sections of society. And really, we need to turn that on its head. We need to have much more inclusive forms. We need to take away the green benches. We need to work across party lines. We have the whipping system, which puts individual MPs under incredible pressure to put their loyalty to the party ahead of their own individual conscience and their own constituents. And, many of the practices in politics, if they happened in business, we would think they were criminal,
Mm.
to threaten or bribe a politician to do what the party leader wants by saying that they can have funds for a project in their community. I mean, these things happen, and that's just not right. That's just
Mm.
not how it should be. And so we think we should really take some of the best practices that have been developed elsewhere and put them in politics. And one other issue I want to talk about, because it's really dominating the kind of politics we have at the moment, is the issue of honesty
Mm.
and the fact that in most other professions, there are rules which prevent you being dishonest or deceiving your employer or the public. If you're a surgeon, if you're a barista making coffee, if you're selling a car, you can't misrepresent, you can't
Mm.
fraudulently misrepresent the truth about the facts of what you're selling. And yet in politics, there's absolutely no recourse. The Brexit vote that happened in the UK happened because of systematic lying, which was amplified by the media and social media in all sorts of ways. And there was absolutely no way of stopping it. So we've actually devised a piece of legislation which would disqualify from office any politician or candidate who deliberately lied about the facts. So it's not about rhetorical flourishes or making a mistake in the heat of an interview. This is the systematic misuse of factual truths to achieve a political outcome. And Wales has committed to introducing that. So we're now hoping to bring that measure to Westminster, and it's available for any other democracy that really wants to protect itself from what we've seen in America. Because if this measure was in place, Trump could not have been elected. A known liar should not be able to hold any form of political office, let alone the highest form of political office. It's just basic.
Mm. So, when we think about kindness or compassion in politics, I mean, there's probably no parent that doesn't try and teach their children to be kind and considerate and thoughtful. And, those politicians who are parents, I'm sure they teach their children to be kind, considerate, and thoughtful. So, what do you think needs to happen for the pollies to recognize that how they function out in the real world has to be the same within their political system? Like what's required for them to take notice, do you think?
I think a lot of them have taken notice, and particularly the women do not like the way politics operates, but it's the system. It's systemic. And if you want to fight for your constituents to get their best interest put forward, you can't afford to put yourself outside the system. Otherwise, you won't be able to represent your people effectively. So there are many people, many politicians, and in the whole time I've been in and around the political space for nearly 40 years, I think there's only one or two people I've met who are politicians who weren't there to try and make the world better in some way.
Mm.
And so they may have, ideas that we violently disagree with, but that essential motivation is good. And then what happens? You enter the political space and you realize that if you want your ideas to be implemented, you have to trample on others, you have to horse trade on votes, you have to say things you don't mean in order to curry favor. You have to do all these things, and gradually you abandon the very values that you came into politics to implement. And so we work with one eminent psychologist who says that many of the cabinet are in a psychologically disassociated state because we have
Mm.
a system in which it is so difficult to care, so difficult to care because the space isn't created for caring as a driver. And I just like to say, imagine for one moment what it would be like if compassion or kindness were the governing purpose of government.
Yeah.
Imagine if that, we politics has really lost its moral compass, and we think that compassion and kindness is the magnetic north. So many things would flow from that instead of having an economy that was based on growth at a time when we know that growth is causing climate catastrophe. We would have well-being economies where instead of measuring GDP, we would measure the well-being across a whole basket of areas of individual citizens. We would prioritize nature. We would prioritize employment that respects workers' rights, and we would create a very different country. And really, this lie that it's survival of the fittest, going back to Darwin never said survival of the fittest. That was said by Herbert Spencer. If you read Darwin with kind of kindness or compassion in mind, you realize that what he was really saying is that the reason we humans have survived is because we have raised our children, because we have cared, because we have come together to defend ourselves from whatever threats we face. So, in fact, it's survival of the kindness, not survival of the fittest. And yet, we've organized our society around this much more aggressive model of living, and it's caused all sorts of problems. Just look around our world:
Mm.
hunger, deprivation, war, conflict,
Yeah.
runaway climate change. All of those things have happened because we've ignored our essential nature, which is to care, to cooperate, and to collaborate. But a few aggressive individuals have really reshaped us and given us a different ideology, which is not the one that accords to our true nature as humans. And that's why so many of us feel divorced from the way government happens.
So, how do we not feel helpless and hopeless and despairing around these things? Because it does seem, sometimes so overwhelming. The possibility of change seems so unlikely. So how do we, like, what can we do? What can we do as, is it, whether it's as an individual, or is it a community or a family or a school system or whatever? How do we take steps to, first of all, to not feel that despair, but secondly, to be, gently proactive, I guess?
I love that question. And the antidote to despair is action.
Mm,
So when we take action, we step out of despair and into agency. And that action doesn't have to be big. That action can start with smiling at a stranger on the bus or making a face at a child who's looking bored and about to kick off. It can start in very, very small ways. It's about how we live as individuals, and we all have agency, whatever our circumstances, we have agency to put kindness and compassion at the center of our lives. And that has a ripple effect.
mm,
And that's the starting place. Every day we have choices about how we live, how we interact, how we purchase, how we work, and we can choose. That's the biggest act of rebellion for me. I can choose in a system where cruelty and other injustices are happening. I can choose to act with kindness, compassion, and love, irrespective.
mm,
And once we start acting in that way, instead of feeling despairing, bleak, depressed, we start to generate. It's a very generative way of being, and we start to fill our hearts and our well-being rises. And then we can look at other things. We can get involved in projects. We can get involved in politics. We can get involved in our neighborhood. We can get involved in any level. And it often feels overwhelming to choose how to get involved. So I have a test, which is to find your heartbreak, to look around you. I often, when we do a lot of training, when I work with groups, I say, go home and watch the evening news. And as you watch, notice which item breaks your heart the most, because there are a lot of heartbreaks out there. And start with that, the thing that makes your heart break most. For some people, it may be animal welfare or child cruelty, or it may be nature, or it may be the built environment, or we don't know. But each person has their own heartbreak, and then find a way of doing something about the thing that breaks your heart the most, just a tiny little entryway action. And then you become part of the solution. And
mm.
that is a completely different way of living. Once we're part of the solution, um, I find I work in the political space. I'm surrounded by people who are doomers and who are despondent and in despair. But so long as we're part of the solution, we're doing everything we can, and we can feel much better about our lives individually and collectively.
And I think sometimes we forget, we're so overwhelmed with the darkness that we actually forget there's kindness happening every single moment of every single day in every single corner of the world. It's just that it's not being played on a big screen, but it's happening every moment of every day. And I think we have to sort of remember that, we have to remember that there's an enormous amount of kindness and compassion and empathy and understanding and lack of judgment and all of those sorts of things that are actually occurring out there, but we're so focused on the on the
They
on
don't
the
drive the clicks. They
no,
don't
they
drive
don't
the
have
clicks.
the clicks.
And they
No.
don't drive the clicks in our psychology as well. We have, from an evolutionary perspective, an inbuilt negativity. 87% of our thoughts, roughly, are negative. So we scan the horizon looking for the things that signal danger, as if we're still living in, a caveman state. But in
Mm.
fact, we're living in a different era. And one of the practices that I find most helpful is a gratitude practice,
Oh yes.
because it helps me to join a different set of dots. When I'm looking out and noticing all the things that are wrong, all the things that there are to despair about, I can feel quite bleak. But if I I mean, I do it every day. I just make a list of 10 things that have happened that have brought me joy or that I'm glad have happened. And they can be tiny little things. And that changes my alchemy and that changes how I feel. So practices like gratitude, I can't remember how we got onto this, are
Mm.
really important if we want to build our own resilience and we can teach them to our children as well.
And gratitude really reinforces kindness. I think the power of kindness and why I'm really excited to have you and Professor Banerjee speak is that, we forget the power that there is in kindness. Kindness can destroy polarization. Like kindness can reduces the idea of adversity because it creates unity. It creates harmony. But I think we forget because, again, we're so inundated with the polarized views of and the black and whiteness of things, but that aren't actually black and white at all. I think very little is, really that black and white. But so how do you? I mean, gratitude is amazing, but if we're looking at it from a kindness, compassion, empathy perspective, like what do you think we can do as a society to influence our pollies? Like what can we do to encourage them to be brave? Because it is brave, isn't it? It is courageous, I think, to try and go against the system a little bit. So, what can we do from a societal, cultural sort of perspective to support them to develop their kindness and compassion in politics?
It's really, really brave. And one of the things that Compassion in Politics does is it tries to support those politicians who are taking a stand on compassionate matters. Um, so, sending individual messages to support politicians' inboxes are just full of hate and
Mm.
complaints and threats. I mean, it is a terrible, terrible job right now. And if we want people who care to remain in that job, we need to support them. We need to nourish them. We need to tell them that we see the good that they're doing and not just the bad. The politicians that we work with are often facing threats to themselves and to their teams just for going about the daily business of democracy. And democracy is fragile. We take it for granted. But in an environment where politicians are frightened to be in the street or to go to an event for fear of what might happen to them, that's really, really serious. So the more we can show our appreciation, and it's a public service that takes everything being a politician. You're on display the whole time, you're on the whole time, you leave Parliament for the weekend and you're visible. Everyone knows who you are. You've lost all your privacy. You have an inbox that is never done, and you're working in an incredibly difficult and hostile environment. So picking up those who show compassion is a really important thing, or getting in touch and joining Compassion in Politics. And what we're doing is creating a kind of cohort of MPs across party lines, of politicians across party lines who want to prioritize compassion, because often it's hard to build those allegiances within one's own party. Sometimes it involves standing up against one's own party, and that can be very, very lonely.
Mm. Do you think we can have kind leaders?
Oh, definitely. I think kindness is the biggest strength. The biggest lie that we have been told is that kindness is soft. Kindness is really, really tough. It can be tough to practice, but it's also incredibly courageous. And the best leaders are the leaders that lead from the heart with kindness, who look at what they can do to address the suffering that they see in their communities and amongst their citizens, and then take action to address it. And you know, we're not idiots. We know when someone's being authentic. We know when someone's being kind. We know when someone's being calculating. And if we just look at the leadership of Jacinda Ardern, although it's, as always, it's being rewritten now, she's not in power, and we put people on a pedestal, and then and then try to take them down. But she led, she cared, and that inspired not just her own nation, but the whole world to see a female leader who led from the heart.
Do you think that's, I mean, I wrote a thesis many years ago for my master's degree, talking about women in power, and that the world will only change when we have more women in power. Do you think that that's the way to go? Like, do you think to start a process, because, it's said, accurately or not, that, women are the nurturers, women are the mothers, so do you think that's the way to encourage more women to become involved in the political system?
I think there are two things to do with gender. One is that qualities which are seen as female qualities are not encouraged in the political space. It's a very patriarchal environment in which caring and compassion are seen as weakness. And that's partly why compassion in politics started, because it needs to be seen as a legitimate political driver. So compassion can be dismissed from the political space in much the same way as women have been, and unfortunately still are, dismissed in the workplace. Nice to have around, but you don't want them in the room when you're making the tough decisions. That's a job for the men.
Mm.
So compassion belongs right in the center of things, and it, unfortunately, it is often gendered. But the other thing is, it's having more women helps. But when I began this work, I wrote a piece for The Guardian back in the 1980s or early 90s, I think 1980s, in which we had something like 43 members of parliament who were women. And now we have nearly 40, in the mid 40%. So we have so
Mm.
many more women, so many more women. But the problems women face have got so much worse. I redid the piece for The Guardian, went back and spoke to those women I'd interviewed 30 years previously, and they all said the political space is much worse. So it's the system. We keep pouring more women into a system that is broken, that is brutal, that is not fit for purpose. So we need to mend our broken politics, and then those women who are there within the political system can really have an impact on how we live.
So how do we do that? How do we change the system using a kind, compassionate, empathic model?
So year one, we get rid of all the conflict-based ways of operating within the political system, and we have proper enforceable codes of conduct. If you lie, if you deceive,
Mm.
then you can't be a politician. End of story. We have to have the same strictness and also the fitness to practice tests that we have in other professions. This is a leadership role, and we can't have leaders who are operating in ways that are corrupt and wouldn't be allowed in any other workplace. So we get rid of the way we argue and discuss things on the floor of the house. We stop sitting in tribal blocks. If this were a classroom, um, the teacher would mix people up and not have the
Mm.
group sitting together. It's really not rocket science. So let's start with the things that cost no money whatsoever and make them happen, so that we change the way we relate, so that we stop seeing the other side as enemies and start working for the good of the nation. At the moment, in the political system we politicians are obliged to work for the good of their party, in the hope that when their party wins, their party will then do the good that they want done. But we really need everyone to be pulling for the good of the nation ab initio. That's why politicians are there, to be public servants and serve the people of the country. So let's change the system so that it's actually possible to do that. And then let's introduce bars on passing legislation which cause harm to those in the most vulnerable circumstances. Let's make sure that our basic rights and our needs are recognised in law, so that no one goes hungry in our wealthy communities and societies. Let's create a bottom, a safety net beneath which no one can drop. And then let's look at how we organize. Let's look at what the purpose of government is. Is it to increase wealth, or is it to increase well-being? And really just have a different set of priorities. And it's a little bit like spiritual or political chiropractic. You realign.
Mm,
You've got all the mechanisms, but they're pointing in the wrong direction. So
mm,
when you put compassion or kindness as the goal, then everything tilts in a different direction, and
mm,
we're pointed somewhere else, and then we start to deliver the outcomes we want. We all want to be happier, but
mm,
wealth is not going to bring more happiness, and yet our whole nations are built around
mm.
consumption and extraction.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And it's using language. I mean, the thing I love about it is that compassion in politics is so overt. It's not like a sneaky way of, trying to influence. It's just beautifully overt in what it's about. Now, you also have a compassion in politics here in Australia. So can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, how is that engaging or starting the process of engaging with our political system? Because I think it's relatively new here.
Yet we haven't officially launched yet.
Oh, no.
No, so you're hearing it here for the first time. We're getting ready to launch next year, and we're largely volunteer led, so it's an incredible team of volunteers here, and they're always looking for more people. So get in touch if you'd like to get involved.
Mm,
And the first thing we've done is worked with another organization called the Apolitical Foundation to do a survey of the well-being of politicians. And we've had an incredible response to that, and we'll be releasing the results next year. But what it shows is that many people who are working in politics have become emotionally and mentally unwell as a result of the system that they're in. And
mm,
so, in addition to the moral reasons for changing the systems, there's also a very practical reason, which is that it's actually intolerable to work in. And so, what happens is that those who are most sensitive get driven out. Sorry, I just had a little phone call there.
mm.
Those who are most sensitive get driven out of the political space. So that will be published, and that will be our way in to talk about what needs to change and how we do politics. Because not only is it not working for all of us, it's also not working for the
Mm.
politicians themselves.
And of course, you're not going to get anybody offering themselves up for the positions. The idea of service also seems to have diminished, I think, too, because the constituents are, demanding, I think. And so it's hard. It makes it
Well,
really
I,
difficult.
it's a really difficult environment, but it's a calling, it's conviction. The work
Yeah.
that you do at Karuna is incredible. That
Mhm.
is really, really, really tough work, and you're called to it, and it takes a lot out of you, but you do it. And it's the same with politics, but politics has such an impact on our lives that we can't
Yeah.
afford to let the system be broken any longer. We have an 18th century system, and we need it to deal with 21st century problems. And so we need to upgrade the operating system pretty quickly in
Mm.
order to be able to deal with the shocks that are coming down the
And
system. So
it's
the other
sorry.
thing,
Mm.
no, I was going to say the other thing we have is a civility code which any politician can sign up to. So we'll be rolling that out next year and asking people to approach their politicians and make sure that they've signed it. And that's really about not making aggressive or accusatory remarks, just focus on the policy. Let's get
Mm.
rid of personal
Yeah.
attacks. Let's talk about the issues. They say in football, play the ball, not the player, and we need that rule in politics.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's to me it's not complicated, but it's like being kind. I don't understand why people don't want to do it in whatever setting, we are in life. But anyway, look, I really appreciate I've taken so much of your time. So thank you so very, very much. I wish you all the very best. For me, kindness and compassion should just be a given. It should be a natural. It is, I believe it's a natural um, human quality that we don't cultivate quite as well
Well,
as.
Yeah, we know that it's innate. We know from studying infants that at the age of roughly 1.5 to 2, a toddler will display distress at the distress of another and act
Mm,
against their own self-interest. So maybe even give a precious toy to soothe the distress of another toddler. So it
yeah.
is there. And whether or not that carries on depends on the culture. Do we have a culture which encourage and cultivates kindness and compassion, or do we have one that shuts it down? And at the moment, we live with this split set of values. Within our home, we act with kindness and compassion. Within our friendship circles, we act with kindness and compassion. And yet, when we go into the outside world of work and government, we're expected to abide by a different method of practice which completely overrides what we know to be right and true. And that causes moral injury to many of us, which we then suppress because it's hard to live with that cognitive dissonance. And we carry on thinking that we're bought into this other way of being, but it's not who we really are, as you say. We're
Mm.
really innately kind and compassionate, and we need our society to reflect and support and amplify that.
I could talk about this for hours with you, but I really do appreciate your energy and your experience and expertise on this. And let's pray that compassion in politics comes to fruition as quickly as possible.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.